start the presentation. We'll start the presentation with Mark Brown.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Brown, the Executive Officer for the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And before we really get going, I do want to mention how excited I personally am about this project. We have a lot of great projects going on with the MWPA and our member agencies, but this one especially excites me. Part of it is that the MWPA was designed to bring multiple jurisdictions together to take care of some big wildfire problems and do it in an ecologically sound fashion. And this project hits all of those parameters. We have multiple jurisdictions involved. It is a high fire threat area, an area that we've had many fires at, fires that could be impacting homes very, very quickly. And we are going about it in a very ecologically sound fashion. So I really am excited about this project. I think there's going to be a lot of benefits. And next slide, please, Emily. So today we would like to introduce you all to this project, describe the rigorous environmental process that we went through, the planning process in general, and then provide you guys all an opportunity for engagement and feedback. As I said, my name is Mark Brown, the Executive Officer for the MWPA. Joining us tonight will be Kate Anderson from the San Rafael Fire Department, the Hazard Mitigation Coordinator, Quinn Gardner, who you already met, the Deputy Director of Emergency Management. Also with us today is Central Marin Fire District, Town of San Anselmo, Ross Valley Fire Department. We have members from the Marin County Parks and Open Space, and then our environmental team from Panorama Environmental is specifically Emily Capello. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the MWPA, and what I like about this slide is that it really tells us the best way to predict the future in wildfire is to look at the past. And while we haven't necessarily been getting as impacted by wildfire as some of our neighbors, we have learned from our neighbors. But if you look at this map, you can actually see that Marin does have a pretty rich wildfire history. In fact, we're about to come up on our 100-year anniversary of the largest fire in Marin, September 17th, 1923, a fire that burned from Ignacio all the way to Bolinas. If a fire could burn like that back in 1923, it can definitely burn like that now. What a lot of people don't know is the first Oakland Hills fire burned that same night and then burned again in 1991. And another fire people don't realize is everyone knows about the Tubbs fire was preceded by the Hanley fire. That same night, September 17, 1923, there was another fire that was in the same footprint as the Hanley and the Tubbs fire. So if you look at this fire history that we have on our map, you can easily predict where fires are going to be. And the San Rafael, San Anselmo hazardous fuels reduction area, it does have a rich history of fire. Next slide, please. How the MW came about was after the 2017 fires, we invited all the law enforcement, fire, and land management agencies to Marin. And we asked them what they were doing prior to the fires, during and after. We asked them what their successes were and what their challenges were. We came up with 7 pages of action items, and I mean single line action items that filled up 7 pages. And what became very clear was that there was no single agency charged with to make sure that all of these action items occurred, and that there was no single agency funded for that. We also had the support of our Marin Civil Grand Jury, who wrote an award-winning report, the report on wildfire preparedness, and they recommended the creation of a joint powers authority with some type of funding tax, and we ended up with a property tax that's about 10 cents per square foot of building space within the MWPA jurisdictional boundaries. Next slide, please. I'll let you read what our mission statement is, but one of the things that we feel the MWPA is supposed to do is bring people together. We see ourselves as a convening agency, and this project really does show that. We have our land managers with Marin County Parks and Open Space, and actually a large private landowner, the cemetery. We have our residents. Thank you here for all of you attending. We really appreciate your interest in this project and being engaged. We have our civic leaders, whether they're elected, appointed, or just informal leaders within our communities. And again, we have many of those people in this room tonight, or virtual room. Our first responders are obviously critical in this, but we cannot do any of our work without our relationships with our private business owners. This project is an example of bringing all these groups together to one goal. Next slide. Speaking of goals, these are our 5 goal areas for our strategic plan. I'm going to start in the middle because our strategic plan really is what we call a house out approach. So I'm going to start with reducing risk to homes. We provide upwards to 33,000 inspections a year throughout the jurisdiction. That's where we meet with our residents and we let them know what they can do for home hardening and defensible space. We're also improving our evacuation systems and our routes. We're improving the speed at which we can get evacuation notifications out. We're increasing the efficiency and efficacy of those notices so that we can be sure that residents receive those evacuation notices in a timely fashion. We're also improving our evacuation routes so that we know that they will be safe while they're on their routes. There's one on the left, reduce wildfire fuels, and that's exactly where this project lands. We have a tremendous volume of fuel in a high fire risk area, and we're going to be able to remove those fuels. But while we're doing it, we're actually making the area, the forested area in that location healthier by removing the non-native vegetation, and we're just going to be able to create increased health in there. Another goal of ours is to educate the public, and we use Fire Safe Marin to that end for much of our public education. But each of our member agencies, San Rafael Fire, Ross Valley Fire, have tremendous public education campaigns that they use to help educate our public. And then finally, we have grants for our residents for home hardening, defensive space. We also have a low-income senior exemption. If they qualify, they won't have to pay the tax on an annual basis. Next slide. And so what the MWPA is really 17 agencies that have come together, but trying to deal with 17 different agencies can get a little bit difficult. So we've broken it up into 5 zones, and these zones that make more sense than just grouping people together. There are different fuel types, different terrain, different road networks, different building construction styles between all 5 of our zones. Novato is mostly grassy oak woodland, not as steep. It's newer construction, has wider roadways. You get down in the southern Marin, you're going to have much steeper terrain, heavier fuels, narrower roads based on when they were built, and much more more difficult to access. And so one size doesn't always fit all. So by having 5 zones, it allows us to tailor a project to meet the needs for that zone. This particular project bridges 2 of our zones, the San Rafael zone and the Central Marin zone. And again, this is one of the reasons why the MWPA was created, so we can have these cross-jurisdictional projects. And with that, I'll pass it off to Quinn.
Great, thanks, Mark. It's so important to understand that this is one big and one very important project, but we have so much going on within the MWPA, and we're all so proud to be a part of it and thankful to all of our voters for supporting these initiatives, and hope this project aligns with everything folks thought they were going to get with the MWPA. With all those goals Mark mentioned. So on the previous map, you saw that zoomed out, and now we kind of keep zooming in a little closer and a little closer. So on the left, you'll see where this project site is. It is right in that border area of San Rafael and San Anselmo, just south of Terra Linda, just at the end of kind of the west end Sun Valley area of San Rafael. It does cover the area kind of behind Sun Valley Elementary through the cemetery. There's a variety of land owning partners within this, and this is, like Mark said, exactly what the MWPA was designed to do. Let us do this work without thinking about the boundaries and the ownership, and really thinking about what we need to be doing to keep our community safe and the risk reduction. And of course, the fire history here. So it is about 145 acres in total. Not necessarily every acre of that will be touched, but that does encompass the entire project site. And you can see how those break down there. We can go to the next slide. So I really want to emphasize that although we're meeting here in a public forum, this has actually been a multi-year project and planning project. And I really want to give a lot of credit on my team, especially to Kate. And I think even in Gavin back in the day for kind of recognizing this as such a critical place in Marin in terms of how that impacts our evacuation routes, how it has the potential to spread fire across roadways. And it just really is such an essential site that needs treatment and that is really full of a lot of invasives. And we have this opportunity not just to reduce our wildfire risk, but to return a lot of our native ground and fuel and ecosystems back to the area, which is really exciting. So you can see the objectives there. Most of this area is going to be focused on non-native eucalyptus trees up to a certain diameter. And Kate's going to dive more into the specifics of all that project. And through that, we're really going to be able to restore a lot more of our native habitat. We can go to the next slide. And this area is incredibly important. And as we see this great flyover footage right to the right of the ridge, this area outside the scope, it's a lot more native. You can see the difference in the fuel type. And then as we move and we get into this project area, it is a southern facing slope, which means it sees a lot more sun. So it dries out quicker. And we have a lot more concerns about what the fire conditions could be. You can see all of that, almost all of that is non-native eucalyptus, although we hope to see it return more to what you see on the right. And then of course, this project and this ridgeline is right between two heavily populated areas as you see those homes in between there. And we have, of course, a variety of evacuation challenges through these areas. Like Mark mentioned, narrow roads, hilly areas, single access points. And so one of the reasons this project really caught our attention too was the density of the fuel. And you can really see that eucalyptus grove as we again follow this drone footage. And so as that wraps up, we'll cover a little bit more about what this project, I'll give you a second just to, it's extra slow this evening, but that's okay. And as we move forward, and so 125 acres, as we mentioned, you can also see that intermixed grassland throughout that. And so it's fascinating when you really start to pay attention to the eucalyptus, how much it stands out compared to a lot of that more native shrub and oak. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And I do think this is really important. And before Kate dives into the details of the project, the planning process, then you'll hear more about the environmental review. I kind of want to hopefully calm nerves as it is, right? We just showed you a really big area with a lot of timber and a lot of eucalyptus in it. But we are not going to be clear cutting large trees. We really are focused on the smaller diameter trees. We are not looking at wet weather operations, so we are not going to have negative impacts in terms of the trails in the area or the hillsides by running heavy machinery or anything there. We are exceptionally aware of the amazing bird population, largely in those trees, and we will be complying with all of the nesting bird regulations, making sure we're retaining those habitats. We are going to avoid long-term trail closures. This is a heavily recreated area. We will have to close certain areas at certain times to do the work, but our goal is to do that in segmented approaches without long-term closures. So we have minimum impact on our recreational access. And we are not going to be broadcasting or spraying herbicide that spreads out and gets all over things and creates any concern. So we have a very controlled approach here. And as you hear more and learn more about the project, please just keep these things in mind. And I believe this is the slide that I'll turn it over to Kate on the next one.
Okay, thank you, Quinn. So I'll take it over from here. I really want to do a deep dive into our project design, what we're really looking at doing on the ground, and we're going to get a little bit technical here. So I really want to highlight, especially back in that drone footage, we really get to see in the context of that really dense stand intermixed with a lot of native vegetation on the hillsides around, as well as the relationship and kind of the proximity to the communities around it. So we can see the hazard, but to really put together a good project description and a prescription to really start doing this work, we wanted to get a more in-depth inventory. And that really helps us quantify what's on the ground. You know, we can see what's there. We know it's a hazard, but now we really get to quantify it. And that helps determine, you know, what type of treatments we're going to do where, how much material we're going to remove, and especially working with different partners, such as Marin County Open Space and our private partners and Town of San Anselmo, we're able to really tailor those different treatments to meet everyone's land management objectives while having an overarching achievement of our wildfire mitigation goals. So how we broke this up and what we can see on the map to the right is that there's going to be 4 different kind of categories of vegetation called strata. So right off the bat, we wanted to inventory Marin County open space lands by themselves to really see what was there, and we can help tailor because they are already a land management agency who does this kind of work to really make sure that we meet all of their objectives. We have a more focused approach there. And then into the private lands, the cemetery, the Cedars of Marin, and then town of San Anselmo. We categorize those into two different strata, which we see here on the map. In both sections, up on the top of the ridge with Marin County open space, and then down below the cemetery and beyond, we were able to break it up into a higher density eucalyptus and a lower density eucalyptus. So we have both in each of those different categories. We're really able to use that data to help design what we want to do on the ground and really guide our CEQA process as well. In addition to kind of the eucalyptus removal and the focus on that, we included defensible space, which extends 150 feet or up to 150 feet from any structures that we already have located in our GIS, which is our Geographic Information System, available publicly from the county. Next slide, Emily. So we've already seen how large this project is, and that drone footage really shows us, one, how large the area is, but also the different slopes and the different factors that are really going to impact how we approach this project. So we're going to have to do it in phases, starting with phase 1, and this is across the entire area. The phase 1 might not happen all at the same time, but we're really going to focus on the thinning of all non-native eucalyptus and looking at trees less than 10 inches in diameter. If we think of like a basketball, that's approximately the same size. So the diameter of a basketball is essentially the diameter of a 10-inch tree. So if we look at this photo up on the top right, all the small trees, the kind of spindly ones growing up pretty tall, that's really what we're focusing on. So being able to clear out a lot of those opens up a lot of growing space for the existing native vegetation that we already have in there, and that was part of our inventory as well. And we're going to be leaving, for the most part, most of the trees over 10 inches, but in the diameter range of 11 to 15 inches, we're going to remove trees where we can, depending on slope, the proximity to the roads, and any other factors that allow us to easily reach those trees without going too far off slope or getting into the steeper areas. In phase 1, we're retaining trees over 15 inches, and we'll get to those in the second phases. So there's a few different treatment methods that we can use for this entire project. All those methods are going to be kind of within the guidelines of the California VTP specific project requirements. That really keeps us in the guardrails. It gives us a really good blueprint of what we can and can't use. And we'll learn more about that later from Emily when we cover our CEQA process. But everything we do is going to really be we'll be factoring in erosion control methods, and we're going to have a lot of slope limitations as well. So that's really built in, and we can go over that a little bit later. So there's two different categories, kind of large categories of treatments. There's our manual treatment, and that's more the hand thinning with the chainsaws. That's what we've been seeing for the most part on a lot of our fuel reduction projects when we have tree crews out there. As Quinn mentioned, we will be introducing herbicide application, but in a really targeted and specific way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. And we do want to focus on tree planting. There's areas for and opportunities for restoration, especially as we start opening up that growing space when we remove the eucalyptus. So we'll be looking at that as well. The other piece is mechanical treatment. And this is where, depending on the slope limitations and the erosion kind of hazard rating of the area, we can introduce heavier equipment for more efficient and streamlined operations. This can be in the way of actually cutting the trees and moving those trees kind of around the project area. That can involve chipping material, which we're very familiar with in this county at this point. And then mastication, which is essentially mulching the material on site. And that's what we see with this yellow excavator with a masticator head. So it's similar to chipping, but it mulches the material right in place. So there's not a whole lot of moving the material around. Next slide, Emily. So I've alluded to herbicide treatments, and that is a crucial part of this project because of the nature of the species that we're targeting. Eucalyptus is a sprouting species, and so without an herbicide treatment, the return interval, or how many times we have to come back and recut or retreat that specific species, is really frequent. So to get ahead of that and to really elongate how many times we have to come in and retreat and maintain this project, we're going to use herbicide in a very targeted, painted on way to stop the sprouting of those trees. So herbicide is done in a really, just like prescribed fire or any other treatment that we do, in a really prescribed way. And through the recommended prescription from a licensed pest control advisor, we have to define our target species. In this case, it's mostly eucalyptus and broom. We have to consider environmental hazards such as watercourses in the area, wildlife species in the area, and different soil types that might be susceptible and vulnerable to different herbicides. There are weather restrictions. We can't apply herbicide when it's super hot or when there's a lot of wind. Or when we know that there's going to be precipitation before or after the treatment. And then there's also other site restriction and buffers that the pest control advisor will build into the prescription. So it's very specific. It's something that we factor a lot into. Next slide, Emily. A big part of this project is going to be biomass disposal, and that is the processing of all the material that we cut and remove from the site. We've seen in the photos and that video just how much material is standing right now. And a really big piece to solve for this project is what to do with it. There's multiple options that we're considering. And as we move through the contracting process, we're going to figure out, depending on our contractor, what the best method might be for this project. But some of the methods that we've already employed in other projects that we want to explore here are pile burning. This is something that Marin County Fire is very competent in. They do every year. We can see that in that upper left photo. This is from a previous project earlier this year. And we can see how relaxed this operation is. It's done under very specific guidelines as well, and we want to start introducing that more. Looking on the more innovative side and kind of things that we haven't tried as much are biochar generation. That can be accomplished multiple ways. And if you attend any ecologically sound practices meetings, that's a really big topic for that group and that they're exploring as well, and that we want to start employing as much as possible. So biochar is essentially a charcoal. It's a burned down product that we can also put back onto the landscape, which facilitates nutrients back into the soil. So we can see two methods of that in the upper right-hand photo and the lower right-hand photo. Two different methods. One is an air curtain burner, and this is a more contained unit. And then the kind of the original way of doing this with a kiln, essentially a contained burn pile. You'll see very similar methods kind of cross corner there. And then the mulching or the masticating that I mentioned is seen in that lower left. And that's where we can mulch the material in place. It stays on site. Next slide, Emily. So with a phase 1, there is going to be a phase 2 after we do that initial thinning of most of the material under 10 inches and some in that medium category of 11 to 15 inch diameter trees. And after we do that, we want to take a step back, see what's left, see where we're at, and we'll probably facilitate another inventory to really see what's left on site and where we can start forming new treatment units to remove more eucalyptus where it's feasible to. These smaller units are going to be broken up by ownership, as we saw with the Marin County Open Space, and then the rest of the ownerships lower down the slope, but also broken up by the aspect, which is the direction that the slope faces. Most of this is southern facing, and the steepness of the slope, and also the proximity and access to the fire roads, and kind of how we can actually reach most of this material. As we remove larger trees, we do want to factor in the erosion control. So all these tree stumps are going to be left in place. We're not pulling any stumps and creating that ground disturbance. And then I know in previous conversations with other stakeholders, the ridgeline larger trees have been a topic that keeps coming up. And because those trees don't pose as much of a threat, they don't have any laddering fuels, they're well maintained, they're spaced out. Most of those are going to stay in place, and we're going to focus on the lower part of the slope. And then the last part, we just really want to see what native plantings are already established. That was part of our inventory, and we did discover that there's a lot of native trees and species that we want to retain already on site. And the more we thin out the eucalyptus, the more we'll be able to see more of those native trees and be able to thin around that and really give those a chance to kind of release and grow when they have more sunlight and space to grow. Next slide, Emily. So with any project, there's going to be maintenance. I've already talked about herbicide as a follow-up treatment, but other ways that we want to make sure that we're covering all the species, the broom, the eucalyptus, any smaller fleshy fuels like grass that comes up. We want to consider different methods. Herbivory or grazing has been a tactic and a strategy that we employ on a lot of our projects that we want to include in an option. But as we have this space open up, we want to focus on that restoration planting if we need to establish more native trees in more open areas. And then we also want to have an ongoing inventory evaluation of the regrowth of broom species and eucalyptus. So this is a really good example in these photos of an untreated eucalyptus that was cut on some of our other projects in previous years, and just how fast these sprouts come back. These are only about 1 to 2 years old. They've had full sunlight, they have enough water, and they've really taken off. We can see how thick those come back and how we really want to manage that before it gets to this point. Next slide, Emily. So it's really important to go over all this because we know that recreation is a huge part of this area. Through Marin County Open Space, into the cemetery, into Town and San Anselmo lands. We know that this is a highly recreated trail system. It's cherished by a lot of the community, which is why we've invited you all here to talk about how we're going to negotiate around these trails. So trail closures in the active work areas are required to keep the public and our tree crews safe. The trail closures are temporary, and we're hoping that they won't be long-term throughout the project. And then all of the trail closures, we really just want to get the point across that they will be announced ahead of time, either on physical signs out on the trailheads. We'll have kind of a running list of what is closed and when, with enough lead time to be able to plan your recreation around that. We'll also make it available through social media, the project webpage, where you found the Zoom link, through our fire agency websites, Marin County Parks website, and then the physical signs, as I mentioned. So with this type of work, we really wanted to highlight some similar types of this fuel reduction work. And one that really came to mind is along the McNair Ridge in China Camp State Park on the east side of San Rafael. And this is really important to highlight because of the size and scale of this project, and also the fact that it was only 20 years ago. I'd love to talk to anyone who had seen this grove before it was cut, who has lived through kind of what that process looked like, to shed light on just how much it's recovered. And that's really the point. Is when we have a lot of standing material, kind of that intermediate point when the work's actually in progress, it's going to look a lot different. It's going to look like a logging operation. There's going to be a lot of material. All of that is cleaned up throughout the process while the project is being completed. And there's going to be a recovery period afterwards where it's not going to look like it did before. But going up to McNair Ridge, the way that it's recovered and the way that they've expedited that with plantings of native grasses, native oaks, and I believe they did use herbicide treatment to help limit the amount of sprouts that came back, is a really, really good example of what this project could be in enough time moving forward, and being able to keep that end result in mind, while we're going through it and while we're seeing physical change, is really important. I'll hand it back over to Emily for a few more examples.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about one other example that is an MWPA project. It's in Novato, and it was a eucalyptus removal project along a creek. And so what you can see in both of these figures was, as Kate mentioned, the active work that was ongoing. They removed a fair number, they removed all of the eucalyptus in this area, but they did target all of the native trees for retention, unless they were either very sickly or for some other reason hazardous. But otherwise, they marked them all, they avoided them all when they were cutting down the eucalyptus trees. But as Kate said, during the process, you can see kind of how many trees were removed and just how much activity was ongoing. The next slide is this same area. It was once they had removed the eucalyptus trees. You can see in the background of the photo on the left that there were some of the native trees that they left there, where really they had opened up. All of a sudden they were getting a lot more light. And then in addition, in the foreground of that same photo, you can see some of the restoration work that they were doing. So some of the planting. And the photo on the right shows a willow stick that was planted as part of the restoration, because the planting really targeted appropriate species for that area. I'm going to speak a little bit about the CEQA process, or the environmental review process under the California Environmental Quality Act. I want to talk a little bit about what we've already done, and then I'll move it into the actual CEQA document itself. So in order to be able to draft your CEQA document, you need to know what is at the site and what the conditions are. So we've done some background work on both biological and cultural resources. We did desktop studies for both of them. And in addition, we really want to make sure that we had some boots on the ground. And so we had reconnaissance surveys. It's a requirement under the California VTP, but it's also just really helpful to know kind of what's going on in your site. So we had biologists out to do that. And then in addition, under the California VTP, there are a fair amount of requirements that you need to do in order to complete your project. And one of them is botanical surveys. There are specific timeframes when you can do your botanical surveys. So while the exact timing for implementation is not known yet, with the idea that it might start this year, we wanted to make sure not to miss that appropriate season so that we could capture all the botanical surveys in their appropriate seasons. So we went ahead and did those in the spring of this year, so that if we are able to start implementation in the fall or winter of this year, we would know what was on the ground. So those are already completed. As I mentioned, for cultural resources, there was a desktop review. There was also a record search for any known resources in the area, and that gives us a good idea of what might be there and what we would need to look for during implementation. There's also a slope and a soil review that goes into the project-specific analysis. And that's because we want to be able to make sure that all of the effects would be covered under that CEQA analysis. As I mentioned earlier, and I think we've been talking about, there is a program EIR under the called the CAL FIRE Vegetation Treatment Plan program EIR that covers the entire state of California, and it really looked at a wide variety of different types of vegetation treatment and consider the environmental effects of them. In doing so, it set out thresholds for different types of projects that could be analyzed under that program EIR. And also, when it looked at each of the different impacts, it considered what are some project-specific requirements that would reduce those effects, and also what are some mitigation measures that might further reduce those effects if needed. It then came up with a process that's called a project-specific analysis, where you look at your specific project under this programmatic EIR and make sure that all of the potential effects of your project would fall under this analysis that was previously done. And if they do, then you get to complete a PSA and it can be certified through that process. So that's what we're doing right now. We're creating the PSA and we are including an addendum to the PSA because not 100% of the area that we may treat would fall within the treatable landscape under the CalVTP, and they anticipate that this might be the case. So they provided a process where you can kind of widen that area that was looked at as long as the conditions are the same and that you can really reduce the effects in the same manner. Another thing that we are adding the addendum for is those biochar options that Kate spoke about earlier, because when the CalVTP EIR was finalized, they didn't really think about all the different sort of future options that might be coming into play. And they've actually recognized that themselves right now, CAL FIRE has, because they have talked on their website about how to really incorporate these biochar options into your PSA. So once we've looked at all of the effects of the project, we'll then see whether or not they fall within the CalVTP. And then we will look at standard project requirements, which would make sure to reduce any of those effects that we've identified and some additional mitigation measures. And some of those standard project requirements, for example, are the botanical surveys that I talked about. So we've already completed some because we just really want to make sure that we're not missing any windows. One thing to keep in mind is that because it's a certified EIR that we're doing this process under, they don't have a formal public review period, but all of the agencies and the MWPA really do want to get the information out to the public. So we're hosting we are hosting this meeting. There'll be another site visit that we'll talk about a little bit later, just in order to make sure that the public is aware of this project and that they're partners in its implementation. And then our goal is to really finish this environmental review this year so that we can get to the implementation stage. This is just a brief schedule. We'll make sure that the slides and the presentation is online, but if anybody wants to just kind of know an overview of where we're at, what we've completed and what's coming next, as we mentioned, we've done a tree inventory, we've done some of the reports, we're working through community and agency outreach, which will be ongoing. And then we're really diving into the CEQA document itself over the summer and into the fall. Once the CEQA document is complete, then it would go to the MWPA for review and approval. And then they would also adopt a mitigation measure reporting plan and also the findings. And we anticipate that in the fall or winter of this year. And that's just to get through CEQA. Then you get to selecting a contractor and all that happens prior to initial implementation. So the timing isn't hard and fast just yet, but these are our general ideas. As I mentioned, there will be a site visit on August 29th, and we're gonna just continue plugging it because we hope to see as many people as possible at that site visit. Kate, I'll hand it back to you to close this out.
All right, thanks, Emily. So as we continue kind of moving through this process, we really, there's been questions from community members, especially those in close proximity to the project about what they can do to help support the project and promote it to people who want to learn more as well. And the first point in that is to complete and maintain your property's defensible space. As Mark mentioned, in the goals of the MWPA are first and foremost to preventing wildfire damage to your home and your property, starting from the house out. And this project and this landscape management is there to support the work that you do at your individual property. The other piece that we're really helping to support and promote amongst residents who want to take action in their neighborhood is to organize or participate in a broom pulling day. This is something that we've helped support for years for interested residents. And we have some longer term groups that meet in the open space around their homes and their neighborhoods to help get ahead of removing this invasive species that also is a fire hazard. So email us or call us if you're interested in that. We're happy to help. And then if you want to continue to keep being informed about the project, we invite you to keep attending the public meetings or reviewing the follow-up updates on our website. And that's hosted through the MWPA website for this specific project. We'll have all of our public meetings posted there. We encourage you to keep showing up. And then to help others, we really encourage everyone to share the official project updates through the channels of our website or through these presentations with interested friends, family, and neighbors throughout all parts of the project implementation, from this planning process, through active project operations, and really get the word out about trail closures and what they're doing and what you might be seeing out there. A big thing once we start operations is to adhere to the posted trail closures for your safety and for our operators' safety as well. And then, really kicking it off, this month's been pretty heavy for the communication around this project, and we invite everyone who is willing and able to come on a site visit with us and tour the project and really see up close what we're talking about, the specifics of what this project will entail. And that's going to be on Tuesday, August 29th at 10 a.m. at the end of Ridgewood Drive in San Rafael. And so we'll start on Marin County open space lands and start walking into the project. So encourage everyone to come visit with us, and we'll take a nice tour.
Excuse me, can I say something?
We'll have, I think we're almost to questions and answers. If you want to hold on, I think that's our next slide.
Yes, I'd like to say something. Can you hear me?
We can. We were thinking we would go through questions in the chat just to make sure we try to get to as many as we can, but why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Okay, I've got to leave. My wife is calling me for dinner. I live in Sun Valley at the west end of Fifth Avenue. And some of the area that you're talking about is the Mount Tam Cemetery. As you drive out to the west end of Fifth Avenue, you automatically go through a gate and you're in the Mount Tam Cemetery. The Mount Tam Cemetery is filled with eucalyptus trees, and there has been no maintenance on these trees. And so the ground around the base of these trees is covered with dead eucalyptus bark that's been there for, I think, years. And this is obviously a real fire hazard because people walk through there a lot. My wife and I walk through there usually 3 or 4 times a week, and people are smoking in there every once in a while. If you can imagine somebody flipping a cigarette into the eucalyptus bark, that whole area would go up very quickly. So I would encourage you, if you can, if you want to just take a drive up through that area and take a look at the eucalyptus on the ground, it's really hazardous.
Yeah. Hi, John. Quinn Gardner, City of San Rafael. That, like you mentioned, it is part of the scope for exactly those reasons. And it is an area we've been actively working with the cemetery for years. They are making progress. I know it's not quite as quick as we want to see, but they're included in the scope of this project. So we hope to see some substantial advanced improvement as well. So appreciate the feedback. And I think, like Emily mentioned, we're gonna try to use the chat for most of the questions in case we can group anything together. I appreciate the comment on Firewise, so I just want to acknowledge we should have had that on the last bullet point, is what we can use from you. If you're not a Firewise community, we'd love you to become a Firewise community. And we're grateful to have a couple of our Firewise leaders at our smaller meeting that we did last week to kind of introduce the project to some of those community leaders. So we do fully appreciate our Firewise communities, especially the ones around this project, and appreciate their support on this and all the other things we do, and encourage folks to become Firewise.
I have to leave. I wish you good luck.
Thank you. We appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much. So as I said, I think we're going to start just working through the questions that have been provided on the chat, try to get to as many as we can. And then if after we get to a lot of our questions, people still have questions or want to do a bit more dialogue, we're happy to open it up that way as well. We just want to make sure that we don't miss any of the questions in the chat, and also so that we can group them a bit better. So I just went back to the very beginning of the questions, and the first one I think came pretty early when we were talking about the project, and it asked about the defensible space, because one of our figures that shows the different areas that you'd be working also shows defensible space, and the question was whether that is current defensible space or projected.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. If you don't mind, maybe going back to the slide with the map, that might be a great slide to have up as we go through the Q&A. So defensible space, kind of by definition, is 100 feet from homes. So one of our goals with all of our projects is to be able to help residents create their 100 feet of defensible space if they don't own 100 feet from their home. So we're doing that across the entire county. Honestly, a lot of our different fuel breaks and fuel reduction zones and grazing and all sorts of projects are happening to help maintain that defensible space. So certainly in some cases it's not quite there yet, because residents need to do their part, and that's why that's such a critical component, like Kate mentioned, in terms of the work we need from our residents. But certainly that 100 feet, that is our goal, and we'll continue to work towards that. This project is a little bit unique in the sense that it's not just focused on the defensible space buffer zones. It is focused on a larger scale project because of the density of eucalyptus in this area. So that's a unique component of this project, is we are going beyond 100 feet from structures to be able to really address the fire risk in this area.
Quinn. The next question was just, I think, a clarification that all eucalyptus are non-native, which is correct. But one point that I think Kate made was that this project might also occasionally take out hazardous native trees if required. So then the next question was about how goats might play into the project. There's a mention that they do a good job clearing, but they can occasionally also impact natives.
Yeah, I can take the first part of that, and then if Kate, if you've got more to add, I think like she mentioned on the maintenance slide, goats are always a tool in our toolbox, and I totally imagine them being part of the maintenance of this project. The large focus on the maintenance of this project will be on continuing to remove the eucalyptus from resprouting and the broom from sprouting, which is another question in terms of the broom seeds. And goats can certainly help with that, although broom is not always their favorite. So I will say that while we'll be able to do the eucalyptus and the smaller scale eucalyptus removal is large scale, the overall necessarily grass maintenance of the site isn't necessarily going to be done on all 175 acres or 45 acres, for whichever, I can't quite remember, right? Just for perspective, right? We graze in San Rafael about 175 acres citywide. So grazing this entire site on an annual basis would almost double our grazing, and quite frankly doesn't really meet our land management objectives, just because when we're grazing, we're really focused on areas around homes, along fire roads, etc. But they will be a tool that will be used in select sites on this project to help with the maintenance. Seasonal grasses, which I think was another question as well. So hopefully that addresses the grasses question as well. Kate, anything to add on goats or anybody else?
I can add something on goats. Immediately adjacent to this project, where the ukes are on the left-hand side, we use goats every year to clean up the area. We've been doing that for 6 years now.
Yeah, I think, Sean, that's a really good point, that it's a very strategic and targeted use of the goats. So we're not going to use them, like Quinn said, on the entire project area, but more strategically in the areas around the fire roads, maybe the defensible space, or areas that are a little bit more targeted, but not as widespread. So we can help protect those native plants as well.
Thank you. The next comment was, or question was about whether the Ross Valley Shaded Field Break went through this area and that they didn't see it mapped on any of our maps. And that's a great question. The Shaded Field Break does go through the same area. So it's another example of sort of like building off some of the other work that's happening. And we do have a map for the PSA that kind of shows both of them, and we'll make sure to put that up on the MWPA's website, because it is neat to be able to see kind of how they work in tandem. The next question was about which herbicides would be intended for use. I can start by just saying that the PSA does have some requirements, so there's already some limitations about which herbicides would be allowed under the CalVTP CEQA document. And I don't have them off the top of my head, but we have an FAQ on the MWPA's website, and we could certainly write them there as to which ones would just be the bucket that we could start the use from. It doesn't mean we're going to use all of those, but you would just be able to see which ones are allowed under that document.
Yeah, Emily, that's a great idea. And just to add on to that, we'll have that pest control advisor who's licensed to write the recommendations for this specific site. So that'll become publicly available, and you'll know what we're using based on that recommendation as well.
And just a quick add there, I just want to reiterate that they will be painted on, so they're only going on to the stumps or directly onto the plants that we're trying to treat, again, not the broadcasting. And the other piece of that, and I think this might address a few other questions I see coming up, is we are yet to put this project out and request the proposals for it. And so part of doing that, we will use all the parameters that we've explained to you today. We'll use all the environmental documentation, regulations, et cetera. But ultimately, we need to see these bids that come back from the contractors that do this type of work. And then that will be part of our selection process based on those tools. And so some of this is really looking at the experts that do this large scale type of projects to see exactly what their recommended is, the tools in their toolbox. And that's also going to be part of our biomass disposal policies too. So it's all going to factor in terms of how we make selections on contractors, in terms of the tools and the techniques they're going to use. And it won't be a one size fits all approach throughout this project site either.
One final reminder that we just got is that we would need to make sure that for any particular area, we also abide by that agency's requirements. So for example, San Anselmo has its own herbicide requirements. So that would be part of the consideration as well. The next question was about whether all of the chipping and broadcasting would be distributed on the landscape. For example, the biomass derived from the mulching, whether it would all be put back onto that same area.
I'll take that one. So right now we're exploring other options to utilize those chips if possible. Working with our partner agencies to see if there's ways that we can do that. We're still working that out. In some areas, broadcasting might be the best use, but where we can and we have kind of areas to receive those chips, we do want to start that cycle and kind of create a kind of a self-contained system there if we can.
Thanks, Kate. And that also just ties in exactly to what I just said too, in terms of what type of opportunities come back with the contractors as well. So we're very committed to removing and disposing of the debris in the best possible ways. And I think that's going to be a multifaceted approach. I don't think there's any one solution that's going to work perfectly based on the differences in topography, terrain, et cetera, as well as just how much chips, where we can do chips, time of year, things like that. So we'll use a variety of the tools like Kate mentioned, and a lot of that will be based too on contract recommendations and pricing and all that good stuff.
Thank you. The next question was whether there was any concern that trees on the ridge top, which might be left, would seed downslope and accelerate regrowth.
I can take that one too. So there's always a possibility for that, but through our maintenance program, we're going to have to set up kind of a longer term plan where we inventory that, we are able to use herbicide, cut down whatever we find, and really get a system in place to maintain the work that we do in these couple phases coming up. So yes, it's a possibility, but through our maintenance program, we'll be able to mitigate that.
Thanks. The next question was about a little bit more clarification on what a broom pulling day is.
I can take this one because I love it. And I know Kate's gotten to go out and volunteer some of our residents to do this as well. So broom is an incredibly invasive species with a lot of seedbed, as I think a couple of the comments have made reference to. And one of the best ways to get rid of it is to pull it, so you're actually getting the roots. So we have these anywhere from 3 to 5 foot heavy metal wrench looking things. And we like to loan them out and or invite our volunteers to come to various sites with a lot of broom. So many hands make light work. And then so we all go together and we literally pull these brooms out of the ground. It's easier when the soil's wet rather than right now when things have dried out. And then we can haul them on tarps, so we reduce the seed spread, and then we dispose of them through means. So San Rafael is happy to sponsor broom pull events. If you want to get one in your neighborhood, we will loan you the tools and we will take care of the debris disposal and give you tarps. And we just love bodies. So that's kind of what the volunteer broom pull event is, just how together can we help eliminate broom that continues to be around throughout our native area. So we appreciate, if anyone wants to do that, please do reach out, because it's we do a lot of really large events too. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you. There's the next sort of question is about whether mastication is appropriate for eucalyptus. Eucalyptus have oils in the leaves that can discourage other vegetation growth and also can still burn. So I think that was just understanding a bit more about kind of the eucalyptus itself.
Yeah, I can get us started on that. So yes, you're right that eucalyptus has alleliopathic tendencies, which means that it kind of discourages, like you said, the vegetation growth in the immediate vicinity. I know that's through the roots and maybe the litter. I'm not sure, but I'm looking for research around whether that's through the actual chips and the wood that might be left on site. It's definitely something to consider, but other agencies are using this approach, and we're also watching to see how their sites recover. But the other part of that is we don't want it to be too thick of a layer. So we're trying to use this sparingly and not exceeding a depth, a chip depth of 3 to 4 inches where possible. So where we can remove the material because of the natural tendencies of that plant, that's what we want to do, but we are considering that.
Yeah, Kate, and if I can just, because I see a couple themes kind of coming up with these questions. This is certainly one of them where they're fundamentally, the goal with all of these projects is risk reduction. We cannot completely eliminate the risk. We live in Marin. We want a natural ecosystem, which means things will be combustible and things will burn. And so while as an example, broadcasted eucalyptus chips might not be the absolute ideal situation, it is a vast improvement and a vast reduction in the risk. And so that's what a lot of this is going to target. And there's some other questions asking along similar things. And so, yes, in a perfect ideal world, there might be a couple things we could tweak and do differently. But as designed right now, this project is going to massively reduce risk. And Kate did mention that phased approach too, where we'll start with one step and then we'll continue to work forward to continue to reduce the risk on this site as well as many others across the county and all the zones. So I just want to point that out that, we don't want to let perfection impede our progress here, and that we see ultimately we're still being able to do a lot of good work, even if it's not 100% ideal in terms of risk elimination.
Thanks, Gwen. There were a couple of other questions that I wanted to kind of group together that talked about removal of non-tree vegetation. So one talked about removing the dead grass on the hillside. Another one asked about removing poison oak, which has replaced some of the native grasses and bushes, and whether these projects would address those as well.
Yeah, I'd kind of see my previous response, I guess, in that sense. So certainly in some areas it will work to address it. In some areas it will not be touched. Again, it's a large project site. And then the maintenance will address some other things as well. But we'll continue with things like grasses and flashy fuels. We really focus on those removals along roadways and behind houses. We're obviously not going to be able to clear every hill and marin of grass, and nor do we want to, right? There's a lot of ecological benefit to that grass and habitat, et cetera. So it's a balancing act, as everything is, but it will certainly address some of it. I know that we would love to see more of the poison oak removed, and certainly in some areas, the goats are a great tool for that in some cases, but some days they don't like it either. So it's just, it's a gamble. We'll see some reduction, and it will continue as part of that phased approach as well.
The next question is asking about a grove of acacia trees on the steepest slope of Red Hill near Millbrae Street and whether they'd be included. I guess maybe as a broader question is just sort of other non-natives, maybe either acacias or other groups, whether they might be included.
Yeah, so acacia trees, very similar to eucalyptus, also non-native, very similar properties. If they are included in that defensible space area and where we have access to them, they will be included in the prescription targeted to eucalyptus as well.
There was one about defensible space and just sort of how close all of the neighbors are to the need for the defensible space area, and whether or not there was any kind of recourse for neighbors who might be using defensible space and some who may not. And maybe it gets to MWPA sort of outreach to the neighborhoods about taking care of their own defensible space.
Yeah, Emily, so, and that'll also vary by jurisdiction. So in San Rafael, we have a different citywide vegetation standards than San Anselmo or any of the other neighboring jurisdictions. So I'd encourage you to contact your local fire department and see what options might be available. In San Rafael, yes, there are options, and we do enforcement of large community hazards. And I think the other piece around defensible question I saw around defensible space was, will the project start around defensible space? And that answer is also kind of, we'll have to see what the project scopes and proposals come in from the contractors. A lot of it will come down to access. So we can't necessarily start in necessarily the perfect ideal place. If we can't get there, we might actually have to remove vegetation in order to get to some of those areas. So it'll be a balance, but certainly we'll prioritize the work based on risk, access, and all those factors in terms of timing of it.
Sounds good. Maybe just sort of following along that same theme, there was a question about sort of being able to participate in some of the goat grazing or other activities that was happening on sort of the larger parcels, whether individual properties could participate in those.
We actually get that question a lot. So there are a couple of different opportunities, and we've had folks that have like rented goats for themselves. So there are a variety of goat vendors that will rent to kind of smaller parcels. And then there's a few occasions where if a private landowner site like abuts a already planned grazing site, that we'll work with them and figure out how we can kind of take advantage of scale and potentially leave. So again, I would say contact your most local agency. So if that's San Rafael, by all means, reach out to Caterai. And if that's a different jurisdiction, or if the land abuts a different jurisdiction like Marin County Parks or something, check in with them and see what options are there. But there are some opportunities there.
Another question was about whether further mitigation would be required to return the area to a healthy native habitat.
I'll let the forester answer that one.
Yes, I'm looking at that question. Yeah, just number one, same about the alleliopathic tendencies of eucalyptus. I do want to answer that again, just a little bit more detail, that there are a lot of establishment of native species already on site. From the kind of upper levels, especially what we saw in the drone footage, it looks like it is 100% eucalyptus cover. But there's a surprising amount of healthy native trees already existing in the area. They are able to grow. They are not completely replaced by the eucalyptus. So there still is, the soil characteristics that will support native restoration in those plantings, especially what's already there. As far as further mitigations to return the area to a healthy native habitat, continuing with the maintenance, really being able to make sure that those native plantings or the existing vegetation have that area to grow into. And that's where a really comprehensive maintenance plan comes into play. But also time, knowing that, when we're done with the project, it's not going to look like how we want it to in 20 years. So time's a really big part of this. The area does need time to recover. It's hard to kind of think long-term about that, but that is the reality. And the end goal is not, at the end of this project, we still need to be patient and allow the site to recover on its own terms as well. And that's just a part of the game.
Sounds good. Kate, there was also a question about coyote bush, whether it was native.
They are native to California.
There was a question about whether if you want to remove eucalyptus on your property, how can you access appropriate herbicides to reduce growth?
My best recommendation is to go through a licensed contractor who has either they are a pest control advisor, so they're able to write the appropriate prescription for your property, or a contractor who has access to a pest control advisor. So go through a licensed contractor, tree companies in the area have that on hand, and that's part of their scope typically.
Great. There was a question about explaining why we would leave any eucalyptus on the project as opposed to removing all of them.
There's a couple different ways to approach that. From a feasibility standpoint, it's going to be difficult to remove a lot of those really mature, very large trees without any detrimental effects to the slope, ground disturbance, but also cost. It's very costly to do this. And to mitigate the most wildfire risk, the approach that we're taking, removing the smaller fuels, the ladder fuels, and those surface fuels is the best way to mitigate the risk the quickest. In that phase 2 and beyond, if funding becomes available and it's feasible to do so, we can look at removing some of the larger trees. But Jim Chayka from Marin County Parks also has a perspective on some of the larger trees up on the ridgetop and kind of the value to the community as they've made aware to us. So Jim, if you have any follow-up to that, I would appreciate it.
Sure, I can just jump in, introduce myself. Jim Chayka, Superintendent of Marin County Parks. And Kate, just building on what you said, I think, obviously the large mature eucalyptus are not part of the scope of this project. Our observations just from a biological standpoint is that there is, some raptor activity in that area, and it's something that we're continuing to monitor. That's something that, is a benefit to the preserve, and it's a benefit to the community. Obviously, it's a benefit to the species that use those trees. So, for now, those are enough reasons to exclude that from the scope. But it's definitely something that, as this project gets phased, and we continue to kind of monitor the conditions in the area, we can continue to look at that and see what the raptor activity looks like. But, there's no plans to touch any of those trees on the ridge now. But yeah, we will continue to work with our fire partners and all of our environmental stakeholders to, always look at that. Kate, is there anything else I can add, or was there a different aspect of the question you wanted me to address?
Oh, no, that's perfect. I know, especially from the community standpoint, these trees kind of from a spiritual standpoint too, you know, there's a kind of the historical and cultural aspect of some of these larger trees. And we know as part of the recreation too, that some of these larger trees hold a lot of value as well.
Yeah, no, there are some residents there that are really passionate about those trees for all the reasons that we mentioned, and we support that too. So, yeah.
And I would just mention that we did get some comments about how the trees are really appreciated for shade. They also are a habitat for hawks, as Jim mentioned, and the mature trees are also something that can be really useful. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Emily. I was trying to get myself off mute in terms of jumping in that. I think that's the perfect kind of, we're trying to find that balance, right, of how do we retain enough for the habitat of creatures that rely on them, especially while we watch our native forest resume and take over that role. And then as we look at this phased approach, maybe we can remove bigger eucalyptus because we've got more mature oaks in the area or other things. But that's a process. And like Kate mentioned on that other site, right, it's a multi-decade process. And so this first phase of the project is looking at that immediate fire risk, those smaller, really dense pieces, as well as some, general cleanup of the litter that the bigger ukes produce, certainly. But that we're going to make progress and hopefully strike that middle ground between retaining enough so that we're not impacting habitats, pollinators, et cetera, but that we are removing enough to give space for our native ecosystem to replenish and still reduce that fire risk. So I think we found that right balance, and a lot of that was via the surveying and again that multi-year planning process. And I can't thank Jim and all the partners at County Parks and Kate and all the teams that have been involved. There's been a lot of in Panorama, right? There's been a lot of multi-year planning process going into this. So I do hope we're striking that right balance and are hyper aware of the ecological value of this area. And that's one of the reasons we need and want to protect it from devastating fire, which is what we would see at this point, given the density of the fuel loading there. So.
Thank you. I wanted to bring up kind of a topic that hasn't been raised as much, whether there would be an inventory of bird nests and habitats prior to the work commencing. So we are already doing some of that work. When we were talking about the CEQA review, we've had biologists out in the field a couple different times to make sure that they understand the habitat, to do the botanical surveys. But prior to any work being done during the nesting bird season, there would need to be somebody going out there and doing nesting bird surveys, and not only doing the surveys, but then what you're allowed to do would be dependent on what they found. So if they find bird nests in certain areas, there's different buffers that are required depending on the type of bird that is nesting. So it's definitely something that would be required prior to any of the work. Hey, did you want to add anything?
This is Ann Krelak with the MWPA, and I'll just add that raptor nests are protected, and we wouldn't be able to remove a tree with a raptor nest. And so even if it's unoccupied, we'd be mapping raptor nests and avoiding them.
Thank you. Then I wanted to jump to another question that was also kind of a little bit of a different question, which was about changes to trail structure, whether there would be any changes to the trail structure, size, or placement of the trails in the area during the project.
I'll take the very first part of this, Jim, and then if you can maybe add on, I think that we will have to close sections of those trails during the project for access for the work crews. The hope is that we will not have to close it to the point where the area is unusable. It'll just be maybe different paths. But I think that question also is getting a little bit about kind of opportunities to potentially improve or enhance or otherwise alter trails as a result of this project, which I'm not aware of any plans, but Jim, I don't know if you have anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I mean, we're always assessing our road and trail management system, and I don't know if folks are familiar, but we do have a road and trail management plan that does articulate kind of some of the changes. I mean, there's the memorial trail that's in that general area that's been done recently or is under construction now. That's part of that sort of long visioning process that engaged the community to look at new trails. This project doesn't change the plans that we have in any way, and I don't know if Panorama or Ann could speak to this too, but I mean, just one aspect of, I believe the compliance of this work doesn't allow us to build new roads or trails for the purposes of this work. So the work itself isn't going to drive any changes, but I mean, once the work has been completed, if we're seeing, an increase in visitorship, or if there's, something that substantially changes our perspective on, the network there, we would always look at that with the community. But right now there's no plans to do anything in addition to what's already been articulated in the RTMP.
And I can chime in. This is the town of San Anselmo Public Works. Because what they reference is the town is looking at, with the county parks, at a potential, in theory, trail that will become multi-use from Sorge Park up through the county, but that's a long ways off. We've got to have like about 6 community meetings over the next 6 to 12 months, and it's probably years in the making, but I'll just throw that out there.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you. I am just trying to make sure that I didn't miss any. There is a question about whether this project would repair any of the fire roads that were washed out in the storms last year.
It's not part of the design of this project to address fire roads. That's something that our department, if we're just talking about roads that are on parks and open space lands, I mean, that's an ongoing conversation that we have with all of our fire partners to make sure that there's the appropriate access for different types of vehicles for a different fire response. I'd be curious to know exactly what the locations are this person's talking about. So I could put my email in the chat if they have a specific location that that they're concerned about. But our effort, or our goal, is to always to maintain all of our fire roads in good operating conditions, both for fire response and for the public to use. So I'll put that in the chat here, my email address.
Thanks, Jim. I think it's actually in the cemetery, so not on Marin County Parks land.
All right.
Sorry, Kate or Quinn, if you want to talk about it, I don't think this project is looking specifically at fire roads. But we can certainly make a note of that area. So there was one that I kind of jumped at the beginning that was, I'm trying to get back to it, about sort of why you have chosen to kind of work in this industry, what you feel strongly about for this project that I kind of wanted to give space to.
Wow, what a great question. I don't know. Does somebody else want to? Kate, I feel like you have a good. Mark's ready. Mark looks ready. I think it's I mean, functionally, right? Like, we're public servants and we want to support folks, and this is such a critical way. And obviously our recent history dictates things. I mean, personally, I can say I've spent 15 years plus in emergency management, disasters of all kinds. And I think one thing that really fascinates me specifically about wildfire is our ability to actually mitigate it. Hurricanes and some other types of disasters and tornadoes can be a little bit trickier, but we can really make a difference on 2 out of the 3 main things, right, that impact fire behavior. And I think this is just one example of that. But yeah, Mark?
You hit the first one, Quinn, and that is being a public servant and serving the communities that we work in and around. And going back to that slide where I said you can predict the future by looking at the past, and every fire that gets ignited, we are behind in that race. And I've been on enough fires where I've had examples of both, where there was pre-fire work and we succeeded. And I've been at fires where there was no pre-fire work and we did not succeed. And when we see the devastation of the Camp Fire, with 85 people dying in the Camp Fire and 109 people in Maui and growing, there were histories that they could and examples that they could have learned from. And so we are driven in Marin by all of our public safety agencies to get this work done. I heard an earlier story today talking about this specific project. several years ago, I was incident commander of a fire that burned out of the cemetery into the open space lands. And it was impacting homes before we can get fire engines there. So that's the small fire scale. But then let's take it to the really, really big fire scale, that 1923 fire I was talking about. If we have fire burning on this ridge, it's not just going to only impact the immediate area of San Rafael. It is going to jump over San Rafael. It's going to go into Ross, and it's going to jump onto the far side of the Ross Valley and start burning through all those areas. So we know this work needs to get done, and we're motivated to get it done.
Thank you, Mark. I think we have touched on all the topics that were raised, but we did want to leave a moment if anybody has a follow-up, any additional questions. There is a question about safe routes and that was the biggest threat. I imagine that means emergency routes.
Quinn, I can touch on this one. The MWPA throughout all of our jurisdictions are improving evacuation routes. That was one of the first things that we tackled upon, and we have many miles that we've already improved the evacuation routes for, and we continue to do so. And plus, we are engaging in the first ever of its kind evacuation ingress egress risk assessment, identifying the risk of every roadway within the MWPA, identifying the wildfire threat, the road infrastructure threat, the traffic coordination threat, are able to communicate our notifications to personnel or residents in the area, and also modeling human behavior. And so this is allowing us to have a very detailed risk assessment of every roadway. And then when we know why a roadway is risky, now we can start solving the problems for those roadways.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely, Mark. And I would just add that anytime we say our biggest threat, right, my initial gut is we are trying to address, we don't have one biggest threat. We have so many different factors. And at the end of the day, we're really, through those 5 goals, you started off the presentation of the MWPA, right? And that's like the super summary. And we really are taking like a 360 approach to as much as we possibly can, and looking at every aspect of what we can do to reduce our wildfire risk and impact on residents and to keep people safe. And there's a lot of great data coming out of the evacuation study, as you mentioned, and all sorts of other work. So we really are focused on a 360 approach, and I think that's critical. And this is certainly a big piece of it, but there's a lot of other things happening as well. And I encourage everyone to look at the massive project plans we put together every year that outlines all of those different things we're doing.
Thank you. Does anybody want to have any additional follow-ups?
Looks like
Okay.
Belle is in her hand.
You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah. Wonderful. I just, I wanted to, some people have been asking and thinking about, are you meeting your climate change goals with this project? I mean, is there an effort? Are you thinking about, do you have in mind whether the choices you make bear on reducing carbon emissions or increasing sequestration? Do they figure into your planning? I think they do, but I'd appreciate it if someone would comment on that.
Yeah, Belle, I'll take this one. So all of the work that we're doing is trying to incorporate kind of climate change and climate change's effects on the types of fires that we're having, and especially in this area, with all of the smaller fuel and kind of looking ahead to, if a fire does come through, the amount of vegetation that's going to be consumed at a more rapid rate, and spreading to the areas that we don't want to burn or burn as intensely or with the severity can be mitigated by this type of treatment. So the amount of carbon that we are keeping on the ground, keeping in the soil, is going to be preserved a lot more, or with the intention of a lot more, based on the treatments that we're doing. So both within the project area, the surrounding area, but also just the amount of material in our homes. You know, if we can preserve our homes as well, that's also a big carbon release that we do want to keep thinking about in the context of these projects too. So that's a really big part. And, you know, as we know, you know, especially in conifer forests, but also in more eucalyptus forests, you know, we know that larger trees sequester more carbon than smaller, densely packed trees under a lot of competition and a lot of stress. So the more that we can remove those stressed trees, the more the larger eucalyptus that we decide to retain are able to sequester carbon. But it also opens up space for native vegetation to also sequester carbon and begin to restore that soil as well, which we know is a huge carbon sink. So yes, we've thought about that, and especially all the communication with you and ESP, we've really been able to implement that into our project planning. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Good.
Scott, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment. It's not a question, but I wanted to thank you and everyone on the panel today for what you're presenting, for bringing everybody into the loop and having this public information gathering. I think it's been really helpful to answer people's questions, get out the information about what the project entails. And I also want to thank you for doing the project. I think it was very important to note, as I think Quinn mentioned, that we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or whatever that expression is. There's no ideal project. There's no, you know, perfection in any of these kinds of fire management projects. You just do your best. And I have a feeling that everyone involved in this has been prioritizing properly. You're prioritizing the natural environment, wildlife habitat, etc., as well as fire mitigation. So hats off to you, and thank you for having the session today.
Thank you, Scott. I don't see any more. Oh, there's another hand. Michael, please go ahead.
Yeah, what Scott said. We are Firewise liaisons in bordering Firewise sites, which both border this area. And we on our side in San Anselmo have been worried for years about this area and felt totally frustrated about not being able to do anything about it because of the multiple jurisdictions involved and private land ownership. And the cemetery being, shall we say, not the fastest organization to act on its piles and piles and piles of eucalyptus crap. So we're very grateful that you're doing it, and very grateful to the NWPA for creating a unifying force to address this very complex area. So thank you. We've wanted this for years.
Thank you. All right. It doesn't look like that we have any more hands up right now. We really want to give a big thank you for everybody who came and asked questions. As we mentioned, there's an FAQ on the MWPA website that we'll keep adding to, and so there's more information available. There'll also be the web link to the CalVTP project-specific analysis in case anybody is interested kind of in doing a deeper dive of the CEQA document once it's ready. And we're just trying to get as much information out to the public as possible. So thank you very much for coming to the meeting.
Thank you.